I would like to move to another part of the world, which is also under threat. And we're going to go now to the Arctic. So, and Daniel wants to give us some initial thoughts, correct?
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel H. Park from Dartmouth College, and I'm a student researcher with the SIRGE Coalition. Thank you for being here today, and thank you, Brian, for organizing this wonderful event. I would like to thank Dr. Sybil Diver of Stanford for collaboration in this project, and a great appreciation to Pavel Syanziga, Andrei Danilov, and Dmitry Breshkov, who have been working to support the rights of Indigenous peoples as their life's work. I would also like to thank Stephen Emmerman for his technical support on analysis.
Thank you. All right, so you've been doing some research on a lithium mine project, correct? And it's called the Como Sersoike. I'm sorry, I may be saying that wrong. And you're highlighting through your research, I had an opportunity to see the paper that you were distributing earlier today, so thank you so much for doing that. And it highlights serious concerns about biodiversity and Indigenous peoples' rights. Can you walk us through the main risks that this project poses to the community in the territory of the Sami people and the surrounding ecosystems?
Thank you for that question. So to provide some preliminary context, lithium is a vital transition mineral critical for the production of EVs and ubiquitous in modern electronics. Simply put, if it beeps, it most likely contains lithium. Polar Lithium is a joint venture between Nornickel and Rosatom, which proposes to develop an open-pit mine at the Kola-Mazurskoye lithium deposit in the Murmansk region on the Kola Peninsula. These efforts are bolstered by Russian President Putin's goal of making Russia a major global lithium exporter. The Kola Peninsula is home to 60,000 domesticated reindeers and Sami indigenous peoples who continue to engage in reindeer herding and subsistence practices. From a technical perspective, representatives maintain that the local geology poses no radioactive danger and that the associated waste will not jeopardize air, water, or soil quality. Despite these claims, publicly available information raises serious concerns about waste storage, management, and the potential long-term health risks, casting doubt on whether this development can truly avoid harm. So, regarding the current project status, the mine is still in the planning and exploration phase. Publicly disclosed details include a site map for the planned mine, which is on the handouts that was earlier distributed. However, it is critical to understand that there is no definitive guarantee that it will be constructed exactly as planned. With this in mind, several concerns stand out. First of all, there are clear environmental risks, particularly in an Arctic setting. A key concern is tailings management, or the leftover waste material after the mined ore is processed. The plan itself proposes to stack the dry tailings with waste rock near a local settlement. However, these dry stacked tailings can collapse or blow away if not properly stabilized, spreading dust contaminants that are harmful to humans and animals. This may be exacerbated by the Arctic region's extreme weather conditions and winds, which can allow metal-laden dust to drift beyond mine boundaries. Historical examples such as Faro Mine in Yukon, Canada, Bunker Hill in Idaho, USA, and Greenbushes Mine in Australia all demonstrate the clear danger of dust contamination from mines. Furthermore, if there are any sulfide materials present within the tailings, exposing them to air and water may trigger acidic runoff, which is formally referred to as acid mine drainage, and metal leaching into nearby soil and waterways. It is critical to clearly assess the specific levels of testing that have been done regarding toxicity or contamination, and there are often lag times in the onset of acid contamination, which emphasizes the need for ongoing tests. Second, there are clear impacts on indigenous livelihoods. Reindeer herding in particular is vulnerable to disruption by roads, blasting, and dust settling on lichens, the principal food source for reindeers. Although the mine itself does not intersect with reindeer herding routes, the risk of contamination, as previously described, makes it very unlikely to avoid any possible negative externalities on reindeer husbandry. Waterways supporting humans, fish, and wildlife communities are also at risk of contamination. Lastly, it is essential to consider long-term accountability for mine safety. Who ensures ongoing monitoring and remediation in such a remote location when operations eventually cease? This leads us to free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. Under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, FPIC dictates that Indigenous communities be fully informed of a project scope and potential impacts, be consulted freely and without coercion before any approvals, and be empowered to give, or withhold consent. Although some consultations have been mentioned, discussions with local Sami leaders suggest that FPIC may not have been meaningfully observed. As Indigenous peoples' rights experts, Dmitry Bereshkov writes, "No one, of course, makes a separate agreement with the Indigenous peoples. Everything is done within the framework of procedures determined by law, and Indigenous peoples may or may not participate in public discussions." Furthermore, he concludes, "But how, in such a short time, could unprepared listeners, including Sami reindeer herders and fishermen, understand a rather complex, technical, 170-page document, conduct an internal discussion, develop their position, and prepare well-founded proposals?" The question is rhetorical.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding us that although when we look at the Arctic region, and it may look like not very green because everything is white, that there is a lot of biodiversity there. And that is also an ecosystem that is important that we preserve because it's important for the balance. As Indigenous peoples, we believe in balance in the ecosystems, in balance in biodiversity, in balance in our relationships with the land that we stored. So we have 2 more questions for you, and just briefly, if you can tell us who is financing the project, at least from your research, what have you found, and how do financial institutions, whether directly or indirectly, contribute to the human rights and environmental risks involved? And then if you could end on the final question, what lessons should investors draw from this? If there are harms, if there are risks, then what should they learn from what you covered?
Thank you for that question. So based on research, as previously mentioned, this is a joint venture called Polar Lithium between Nornickel and Rosatom, a Russian mining and nuclear energy company respectively. And there were actually reports from earlier this month, April 2025, that indicates a highway in addition to the mine site that will be constructed at the cost of around 40 billion rubles. While bank financing remains unclear, sources reveal that a loan will have to be taken out to build this highway on top of the mine itself, and that Polar Lithium will make payments over the course of 10 to 12 years. This is an important fact to follow. However, there are critical concerns when it comes to financing. Once and if a domestic bank is chosen, they often operate under looser ESG disclosure rules, as the Bank of Russia's information letter titled "Recommendations for Public Joint Stock Companies to Disclose Non-Financial Information Regarding Their Operations" does not impose mandatory requirements, but instead mere guidances that promote transparency between companies and investors. There are also the risk of political sanctions that can further curb external scrutiny. President Putin has previously issued presidential decrees that specifically restrict public disclosures for specific firms and financial institutions, particularly in response to Western sanctions. This is highly relevant regarding the current status of the context. A notable example is the November 2024 decree that granted Novatek and SIRGE, a Russian oil and gas company, the right to limit financial transparency and public reporting in light of Western sanctions. Such executive instruments can curtail visibility in such strategic sectors, raising concern for the future financing of the lithium mining project. And as for your last question, for key takeaways, as a whole, specifically pertaining to this situation, Nornickel, which is an entity of Polar Lithium, has a poor track record in the Arctic, as demonstrated by the disastrous diesel spill in Norilsk in 2020. We believe local communities, activists, and Indigenous leaders should have ready access to the facts about potential impacts so they can clearly raise their concerns and safeguard their rights. We believe that raising awareness on this issue is a major starting step, and community consultation and engagement can work to address many of these key concerns. Historically, for example, Serbia's Jadar project and Chile's Atacama region were significantly reformed due to community-based pressures. This shows that such community-based activism is meaningful and effective. There is an urgency for Indigenous communities to continue demanding inclusive FPIC, which involves a clear and thorough disclosure of relevant studies and long-term monitoring regarding the next steps. Thus, the key accountability question for Polar Lithium and other crucial mining sites remain: what independent evidence can be provided to prove that metals, acid drainage, and dust will stay below harmful levels throughout and after the mine's life? Beyond local engagement, this project also merits international attention. In Russia, due to the lack of endorsement of UN DRIP, many Russian indigenous communities lack support. Furthermore, recent shifts in tariffs, trade, and the green economy transition underscore this challenge of reconciling corporate profits with local community well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I think this is a good segue. We have the great opportunity to have today two speakers who will engage on the conversation around the responsibilities of banks and what policy shifts need to happen. It is incredible that when we come into rooms and discuss the responsibilities with banks, it's almost never the case that banks say a company's track record of human rights will be used to determine whether a project will be financed or not. How is it possible that there are companies that are clearly violating indigenous rights, that are documented cases, but still get financing from big banks? And we need to beg the question, is it really that banks are doing a thorough due diligence, as there are many obligations that they have, many standards that are established, and we will hear more from Kate and Emil in a bit, whether they are in fact conducting their due diligence or knowingly enabling the harms to indigenous people's rights. So we will move to Kate Finn now. And Kate, in your experience, what are financial institutions getting wrong when it comes to indigenous people's rights? Because we've been talking about this for a long time, and especially around self-determination and FPIC. So they know the topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I thank you, Brian, for the opportunity to speak this morning, and for Cultural Survival for hosting us in the Indigenous Media Zone. And we'll say, too, that I really appreciate my role in the SIRGE Coalition as chair of the executive committee, because this is a global issue. This is an issue, and as we're talking about biodiversity in banks, these banks, maybe they're located in the U.S., maybe they're located in Canada, maybe they're located in one jurisdiction, but they have business all over the world. And so we need to make sure that those banks see indigenous peoples. And they're not. They're not. So to your question, I'll start by saying one of the great pleasures and honors of being here at the Permanent Forum is we get to see indigenous peoples in all of our culture and our language, and we get to hear stories. We have the stories about the birds, about the reindeer, about all of the places that we have, about the water. We get to be all of those things. Self-determination is in full bloom in these places, right? Banks don't see that. They are not built to see that. And what they do see is siloed and separated. Sometimes they see water, sometimes they see tailings, sometimes they see dirt, sometimes they see animals, and they very rarely see the people. So when banks hear about indigenous peoples, the places that banks hear from indigenous peoples are usually through grievance mechanisms when something has gone wrong, or when there is conflict, when there is a legal filing or a political filing or a shareholder action. So banks only see a very limited portion of who we are, and that is to their peril. What they need to see is a much broader swath of all of the ways that indigenous peoples are linked to the land and all of the ways that our rights are linked to that land.
Thank you. This is very important, that we as indigenous peoples are connected, a part of the ecosystem, and not in silos. So this is an important point, and I guess to building on this point, then we would like to ask you as well, so for the audience to hear, what are those risks then when banks fail to recognize free, prior, and informed consent, fail to recognize indigenous people's self-determination? What are the risks that they run into? And if you could give us some examples, that would be great.
Absolutely. So we know as indigenous peoples what the risks are of development that happen on our land. From a bank's perspective, the risks of failure to secure FPIC or to finance a project that does not have FPIC are manyfold. They could run into political risk. If they start the development and then the country pulls the permit because there's no consent, that's a risk. They've just capitalized an entire project that will never come to fruition. If there is legal action and there are legal filings, either from the country itself or from Indigenous peoples, that delays the operations and it costs 4x on what the project would be. There can be social opposition. We have many examples of social opposition where, for lack of their consent being recognized, Indigenous peoples and allies stand up and put themselves in harm's way. And banks don't want to be linked to that reputational risk. And in a global world, banks can't just get away with something anymore. They can be linked. We have media. We know how to communicate. We know how to talk to each other. So banks can be linked to the reputational risk. What I see often in my work is really to build bridges between Indigenous peoples and the private sector and to build the business case for FPIC. There's a lot of shareholders at banks. There's folks who are part of banks who really don't ever get disclosures about what the impacts are on the ground. And so by the time there's a legal filing, by the time there's a social action, the shareholders are like, what's going on? Why is this happening? And so what I would always say to banks, what I would say is, you have to design for FPIC. It is Indigenous people's FPIC that needs to be solicited. Indigenous peoples have protocols. We have a way of giving and withholding FPIC, but banks need to design to understand that. What does that mean for the bank? That means that they need to wait. They need to have time. That is the P, that's the prior. They have to be there. They have to provide information. They need to make sure that it's in the right languages, that it's available, all of those things. And then they need to wait for consent to be freely given. And there are ways that banks can design operational policies to respect FPIC so that they don't face incredible amounts of litigation and material risk from missing whether or not consent was freely given.
Thank you. And then finally, and I think this is a question that is in everyone's minds, really, because we've watched, sadly, the impacts that mining can have on the lands of Indigenous peoples. Loss of biodiversity, contamination of the soil. There are even some mines in some countries that are allowed to directly dispose waste into the oceans with no treatment at all of the waste. And we've watched how they have desecrated Indigenous lands, impacted communities, and lately we've seen a lot of mining tailings fail all over the world. And when they do, they cause a lot of harm to the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples. So it's clear for us to see the impacts on Indigenous peoples, but it's very hard to see sometimes that banks can be held accountable. At least in my experience, it's very hard. You never see them come before courts and really be held accountable. So the question that many of us have in our minds is, when they do fail and they cause harm to Indigenous peoples, what does meaningful investor accountability look like? And how can Indigenous peoples use the leverage points in the system to drive real change?
Yeah, so there are so many leverage points that investors can activate with banks that are different, but supportive of Indigenous people's priorities. So there are a lot of investors who hold banks in their portfolios, and through that relationship can create engagements directly with the banks. And we ask those investors who have those relationships to ask the banks high-level questions. Do you have a policy that recognizes the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Policies? And that's great. Does it have FPIC in it? And then how are you operationalizing this? What does this look like in your due diligence? And we aren't asking for it to be an add-on or a separate or a maybe. Every single project, every single aspect needs to be run through these filters because we know that the impacts are on Indigenous people's territories most of the time. And so investors have a particular leverage point. They can ask for those policies. They can ask for those operations. Banks will often they have many different ways of financing projects. They can do it at the project level financing, and they can do it through general corporate financing. And what we've really seen recently is some real movement towards general financing, ensuring that Indigenous peoples and FPIC due diligence is in general financing along with project financing. So there's no loophole. At every stage, banks must screen and understand what the impacts are to Indigenous peoples. And I guess just to finish up here, I think what's important, we're seeing so many moves politically now and all over the world in terms of, should we get rid of ESG, or how are we focusing on diversity? And there's just all kinds of different moves. But the reality is Indigenous peoples are here. We've been here, we're here now, and we'll be here. And so there is always, always a need to screen for the rights of Indigenous peoples in financing. And we are hearing from allied investors that no matter what happens, they will need to screen for this. So it doesn't matter if standards fall to a sub-minimal level. It doesn't matter, if certain policy and legislation falls, although we are hoping that it doesn't. Investors are still looking for the highest quality data and the highest quality assurance that FPIC has been respected.
Thank you so much, Kate. This is absolutely the kind of information that we need to hear, because sometimes it's hard to believe that there can be true and real accountability with banks. But we'll go now to Emil. Emil, and we have the opportunity to have you here today, and thank you so much. So we hear a lot about due diligence, right? And this two words are thrown around all the time. Banks should do due diligence. They should scope for Indigenous people's rights. They should have policies, right? But we would like to hear what are usually the most common due diligence failures you've seen in the context of transition mineral extraction, so nickel, copper, cobalt, and biodiversity.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, as well as thanks for all the speakers for sharing your important stories and insights. So I would like to start with the process on how the mines are permitted. Well, typically most countries would have a regulation on the environmental impact assessment, which is part of the permitting process, as well as some type of consultation. Depending on the national regulation, it's usually not consistent with international human rights law. So there might be no consultation, or there might be a consultation that does not require respect for consent, or they might be false consultations that seek to divide and conquer communities. But usually those processes, they don't assess whether a project should proceed or not. And then from the bank side, there's also the bank standards based on the International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 7 on biodiversity, which mandates the use of the mitigation hierarchy. So according to this, the project developer should avoid, mitigate, restore, and offset their impacts. So based on those standards, as long as the project is implementing those steps, then the project can proceed anyways. But for a lot of Indigenous peoples, we say, no, we don't want mining on our territory, or we don't want oil activities in our territory. But those standards, they don't assess whether a project should proceed or not. As long as you present a plan that you will mitigate the impacts, you will avoid the impacts, you will offset the impact somewhere else, then it can proceed anyways. So given that Indigenous peoples are living in those biodiverse places, of course this also impacts Indigenous peoples. But also those processes are also, they also have there's also an inherent conflict of interest, because the impact assessments are also a lot of times driven by the companies themselves, so it's not actually independent. So the information that's presented to the Indigenous peoples and to the investors and to the regulators is not full and nor objective. Which makes free, prior, and informed consent difficult, because the information is not there. But also the banks are receiving inaccurate information, and then they approve the financing. So I think the biggest mistakes really for banks is that they take it at face value, what the information that's being presented, but the information is, I would say, in most cases actually inaccurate. And this is, banks need to really listen to the communities, and not rely on self-reported information by the companies or by their consultants that do those assessments and reports.
Thank you. And that's a very important point, because oftentimes we find ourselves in situations where consultants are the ones conducting the due diligence instead of banks having direct information that comes from the peoples on the land about their rights, about biodiversity. And this is an amazing segue into the next question, because then if they are making these mistakes, then what does FPIC, and we know FPIC and self-determination must be at the center, but they just treat it as check boxes, and that's why they don't, either just through consultants or others. So what should real implementation of FPIC look like from an investor's perspective?
So as I was mentioning, the information that they receive is usually self-disclosed by the company. So, and because of this inherent conflict of interest, it's not accurately reflecting what's happening on the ground. But also the policies of banks are also weak because they usually expect their clients, the companies, to respect FPIC. So they only expect it, but they don't usually require evidence. But we know the track history or the track record of many companies. Most companies have a poor record with indigenous peoples, and it's difficult to find those cases of companies that have this good track record, that they respected every decision of indigenous peoples to withhold consent, or that all of the relationships were positive. But actually, it's the opposite usually. The many mining companies have many negative impacts on indigenous peoples. So statistically, the banks shouldn't be assuming that the companies are respecting FPIC, because we know that's not what's happening across the world. The typical case is usually that they are not respecting FPIC, but also not just respecting, but they're also having strategies to divide the communities, to criminalize, to present false information. So this should be the starting point for banks to know this is how the companies are operating, and they shouldn't be trusting the companies necessarily. So I think one of the first steps that they should be doing is to strengthen their policies and actually require evidence that, one, that there's no indigenous peoples affected, because companies also might say there's no indigenous peoples here, or they might say those are not indigenous, though they are minorities or peasants. I mean, that's, if you don't recognize indigenous peoples, then there's going to be no FPIC. But then they might also say, yes, we have FPIC, or the majority of the community support and only some are opposed, or they're divided, like those kind of things. So I think they should require evidence of FPIC, but this should also be independently verified, not based on what the company is saying, because they will always say what's convenient to them. They want the project to proceed, and they don't want the challenging voices to be heard by the investors. And also, I think also on the biodiversity side, they also need to strengthen the policies to have the no-go zones, because some indigenous peoples have protocols that say those zones, those territories are intangible. We shouldn't have any activity happening there, not even by indigenous peoples. In my community, for example, we have zones for farming, we have zones for hunting, and we have the intangible zones, like not even us can use this area. But I think the banks also need to look into the history of those territories. In many territories and communities, they have statements from 20 years back, 5 years back, stating what they feel about the mining activities. So in my territory in Ecuador, for example, many of the indigenous organizations, they have stated we don't want any mining here. So there shouldn't be an FPIC process at all, because it's already been withheld. And then when the consultations begin, then all kinds of division tactics and those kind of things are starting. So it would have been better not for it to happen at all, because it was already decided that the consent was withheld. So banks should also be looking into those existing statements and declarations of indigenous peoples. And lastly, they should also require respect for free, prior, and informed consent into their contracts with their clients. So if they're not respecting what's in the contract, then they won't receive the financing.
Thank you, Emil. And we've watched at this session the impacts in indigenous communities, how banks continue to fail to conduct proper due diligence, and what they need to do better. I think we all speak in one voice when we say that the rights to determine what happens on the lands of indigenous peoples does not belong in the hands of consultants, of third parties that are conducting these studies. Instead, they belong in the hands of indigenous peoples who've stewarded these lands for millennia. And we must all do as much as we can for the full realization of the rights of indigenous peoples to really implement free, prior, and informed consent. That we make sure that indigenous peoples have that right and that they decide what happens on their lands is only through that mechanism. So we appreciate your time and that you came here to be with us. We have just about 8 minutes. If anybody has any question that you would like to pose to our speakers today. If not, if there wouldn't be any questions, then we will go to a round of final comments and thoughts. But I would like to open the floor in case anybody has any questions. Yes. So the question is, what can be done to truly change banks' behavior, because communities are facing that? So if Kate and Emil would like to answer, and then we'll leave the word at the end for Daniel and Nove for some final thoughts.
Sure. I think the issue of banks, as Kate was saying, it's a global issue. They're financing companies across the world. So we need to really keep pressuring the banks. But also there's also the standards that the banks use. And they're, as far as I understand, they're being updated right now, the International Finance Corporation standards. So we need to pressure them also to strengthen the protection of indigenous people's rights. And I've heard rumors that they might even be weakened because it's being seen as an obstacle to development. So really getting a lot of indigenous peoples on board on this campaign to pressure the standards to be strengthened. But I think also, like from the community perspective, the issue of banks is one of many strategies. We need to pressure the banks, but we also need to strengthen the communities to have agency and to be united. So, in some cases, the bank issue might not be relevant because they might not have the bank financiers. They might have other types of financing for the companies. So it really depends on the specific community and the companies involved also.
I agree. It will take an ecosystem approach to hold banks accountable and to hold the private sector accountable. So I agree 100% with what Emil said. There's a role for everyone. What we need is direct funding to indigenous peoples to develop their FPIC protocols, to ensure that they have, in ways that banks and the private sector will understand, the protocols necessary to hold the line on consent. Direct funding for technical support and environmental support. It is a lot of money to do a water study in a desert. So what does that look like so that indigenous peoples can have a water study done that reflects their value on water and what that looks like? And then to have that moved to a lithium company so that the lithium company sees that, understands that, and takes that into account. That takes lawyers. We need networks of lawyers that understand indigenous peoples. I think, there's so many networks and there's solidarity and power because, like I said before, banks have global business and they try to make it seem, this is true of not just of banks, of many companies, that every project is hyper-local, but it's not. The banks themselves need to see the global impact of their work, and we as indigenous peoples and as indigenous peoples organizations have global networks and global solidarity. The more that we're able to stand together and show that power, the more that banks will move. 10 years ago, when we were working on standard setting in different arenas, there were one or two indigenous organizations working on the standards. It has quadrupled and quintupled now. There are more and more Indigenous organizations working on the IFC performance standards and working on other things. So as global NGOs, as global organizations, we can hold a line with places like the World Bank, with IFC, with others, to hold that line for FPIC so that when communities come, they are recognized for what they are. So I think there's a lot of different leverage points. Often I work with investors that what we do is forward the priorities of Indigenous peoples to them so that they can hold that line consistently in a consistent engagement. And then when there's an issue, Indigenous peoples can come up through investors and talk directly to that bank. So there's a lot of different leverage points, and I think they work best when we work in solidarity together.
I'd like to emphasize all the speakers' voices here and to reiterate that those with the voice can truly provide the voiceless with the power to truly understand and let people know that this green transition is not all green. There is a true cost when it comes to such mining extraction processes for a green transition, and we need to emphasize this across all communities across the world. Thank you, everybody.